When we think of the domains of life, we usually think of three areas: the land, the waters, and of course, the skies. And if you take a walk outside and look up, chances are if you see an animal, it's a bird. I mean, these guys are absolutely everywhere, and have made a killing of doubling down on aerial capabilities, being responsible for more than 10,000 species worldwide. And they are easily one of the most common vertebrates around just by pure numbers. And simply put, they are the rulers of the sky. And sure, in some areas or caves, bats is what you're going to find lurking above your head, but really, avian dinosaurs are where it's at. And in fact, it's kind of been this way for the entirety of the Cenozoic. And then, before that point, during the Mesozoic, it was another group of icons that was doing the ruling. And that would be the Pterosaurs, of course. In some ways, these guys are even more dominating than birds, reaching wingspans never seen before or after, in some cases rivaling literal planes. And also getting big enough that while standing on the ground, certain genera would have been tall as freaking giraffes. Yeah, not the most pleasant sight to think about. But here's the thing, despite birds and pterosaurs usually being what we imagine to rule, or have ruled the skies for all of history, they have actually only been around for a blink of an eye, as the older of the two, the pterosaurs, appeared just 228 million years ago during the late Triassic, while birds popped up 72 million years ago, give or take, during the Cretaceous. And yes, these are very long times, at least from a human perspective. But don't forget, life's been around for far, far longer, appearing over 1 billion years ago. And for hundreds of millions of years, this included life you could see without a microscope. And so, this may get you wondering, or at least got me wondering, what exactly was ruling the skies before birds or pterosaurs? In other words, if you traveled back far enough and looked up in the sky, what would you have seen? Well, it turns out that pretty much right before the appearance of pterosaurs, there was actually another group of reptiles that were first to reach the skies, in a sense. It might have been the future of the aerial world if it wasn't for a really unfortunate tragic ending. And this was the Vigeltosauridae. Simply put, they are a now extinct family of neodiapsid reptiles that first appeared in the late Permian and were anything but ordinary, as they represent the first instance of vertebrates achieving aerial locomotion, with the oldest member likely being the Coelurosaur avis, with its origins tracing back to about 260.4 million years ago. Like their later distant relatives, these reptiles had evolved wings, although they would have seemed a bit off, as these wings were not attached to their arms, like you've come to expect, but rather jutted out from their ribs, which I know, sounds weird. And actually, it's a bit weirder than this, because it's not that the wings are attached to the ribs, but instead that the ribs themselves have actually become the wings. As in each Vigeltosaurid, they had evolved into highly modified and elongated structures, to which membranes were attached to, forming a kind of kite-like biological apparatus, which pointed upwards in order to capture the most air and allow these guys to take flight. Sort of. As opposed to the later pterosaurs, these reptiles were ultimately gliders, unable to achieve fully propelled flight. But it was a start, and they still were by a large margin the biggest creatures soaring overhead during the late Permian. Now, I do admit though, that isn't exactly saying much, as at the time, flying animals were mostly quite small, and this extended to all the Vigeltosaurids, which typically never got bigger than a common raven, as far as wingspan went. Although, thanks to their tails, they would have been longer than what most birds are. Not to worry though, because despite their odd appearances, you wouldn't have needed to expect one of these guys making a landing strip out of your face, as they were far more interested in insects than other vertebrates. And again, they weren't that big, as it's presumed that bugs are their main food of choice, based off of their sharp and narrow teeth. And given the nature of their grasping hooked claws, it's believed that these reptiles would have spent most of their time attached to trees, which they would then use as launch pads to pretty much yeet themselves in order to catch prey, coasting in the air until they reached their intended targets. And though again they were not truly flying per se, this tactic obviously worked for them, and actually has for others. I mean, just take a look at the living Draco lizards. But because Vigeltosaurids weren't actually that great at maintaining aerial height, they probably could not travel very far, instead relying on climbing up tall trees in order to get some reasonable distance off of their glides. But alas, this build did the trick, and you would have been able to find these reptiles throughout Madagascar, Germany, Great Britain, and the Russian portions of Pangaea, where they inhabited sparse to dense forests of varying nature. And who knows, maybe they would have evolved into fully propelled critters if it wasn't for the terrible timing, as they literally appeared in the very last stage of the Permian, which was succeeded by the Triassic. And you know what happened between the end of the Permian and the start of the Triassic? Just the worst extinction of all time, the Great Dying, which got rid of about 98% of all life. Poof, just gone in the wind. And this unfortunately included the Vigeltosaurids, who would have surely suffered from the loss of forests and the massive die-off seen in their food source, insects. Although, this being said, we do know that something a bit like them definitely survived, at least for a bit, as in the early Olenekian stage of the Triassic, there did exist another group of gliding reptiles, the Quinosauridae. And like the previous, they too had wing-like ribs instead of the arm ones. But coincidentally enough, the two groups were actually not that close related, with paleontologists finding that the internal anatomical differences between the two were too great, although both were indeed diapsids. And in the case of the Quinosauridae, they could be found throughout Triassic Europe and North America, and were in general slightly larger than the Vigeltosaurids, with some, like the Quinosuchus, having 40-inch or 1-meter long wingspans. Though they did stay in the same lane as the Vigeltosaurids, likely being insectivores as well, judging by their pin-like teeth. And it turns out they might have even been less efficient flyers than their predecessors, as a few of the more primitive species probably were not even capable of gliding, instead just relying on parachuting down from trees, while only some of the later, more derived species were able to surf through the air, so you could say. Sadly though, they too were not long for the world, and went extinct by the time the Triassic came to a close. But let's imagine for a second that they didn't go extinct. Rather, that over the course of time, they evolved, getting bigger and more formidable every generation. And to the point that the final result is a giant reptilian apex predator that flies around eating anything it can find. Oh, and also breathes fire. And they get a rename too. Dragons. Now obviously, unfortunately this didn't happen, and they never existed. But if you're like me and watched Dragons: A Fantasy Made Real as a kid, you dang wished they did. And while we might not literally have them, we possibly have the next best thing. A nigh entire encyclopedia devoted to them, as well as today's sponsor, Dragonatomy, a illustrated scientific field guide to dragons. Now I'm excited to be showing you all this, because I do really think it's super cool. It's essentially a what if dragons were real book, and deep dives into their evolution, anatomy, different species, how their adaptations really work, etc. Blending speculative biology with fantasy, and all with handmade art from biologist Topher Stoll. So if you love fire-breathing fantasy dinosaurs, or know someone who does, consider checking it out and supporting the project. Link will be in the pinned comment and video description. And now, back to the video. And though this isn't much, you now know just about all the previous rulers of the skies before pterosaurs and birds. At least that is, when we were strictly talking about vertebrates, as the Vigeltosaurids were, like I said, the first instances of aerial vertebrates. However, there is a major group of flying animals that I've yet to mention, at least in this context, and haven't done so on purpose, and that is insects. We don't often think of flying insects as the real kings of the sky, but at some point, they absolutely were, being the only animals capable of it at certain points, and they held that distinction for quite some time. And for hundreds of millions of years, they would have been the only thing to worry about. And though some modern insects don't exactly make us feel all warm and cozy inside, we should be thanking our stars for the current situation, as before birds or pterosaurs, flying insects are pretty much pure nightmare fuel. Although they didn't necessarily start out that way. As far as we can tell, the first insects to fly appeared about 400 million years ago, during the early Devonian, when Earth was much more watery and warm than it is now, and trees were just starting to really colonize the land, with the true forests actually forming during this period. However, they surely didn't look like any forests you've seen before, as they were dominated by moss and shrub-like trees that were far more primitive than any plant you're used to. But they were key regardless, as the flora provided ample coverage and resources for the very first flyers, with the oldest known genus so far being the Rhyniognatha, an ant-sized bug. Not super impressive or alarming, and it would have come across as a fairly typical small bug to the naked eye. But don't you worry, because you would not have to wait too long for these guys to start bulking up, and getting a bit more interesting, if you get my drift. As right after the Devonian came the Carboniferous, and if you know, you know. And if you don't, I'll tell you. The Carboniferous period was a time dominated by swamps, and not like those you might have visited on a trip. No, these were swamps on roids, as much of the world was wet, warm, and low-lying, leading to vast swampy forests filled with mosses, calamites, horsetails, ferns, and a near countless number of streams, lakes, and rivers. In fact, it was so swampy that the area would have been soupy with fog, and the amount of oxygen during the time was much higher than now, with the percent peaking at 35%, while presently it only stands at 21%. And it seems like all these factors combined really did the trick as far as supercharging flying insects, and really all insects, as their diversity became unhinged during this period, as did their overall sizes, literally reaching wingspans and lengths that gave certain birds and even some pterosaurs a run for their money. In particular, there were two groups that arose which would not be amiss in a horror movie, if you fear bugs that is, with the first being the Paleodictyopteroidea. They just had to make that name long. This is an extinct superorder of beaked insects that first popped up around 326 million years ago. To the naked eye, many of them would have come across as mayflies, having had long bodies and two appendages that stuck out at the back, like some mole hairs that got a little too long. However, if one of these swooped down onto you, I doubt you stop to think about the resemblance. As opposed to mayflies, these guys were giants, being more similar to birds than any living bug. Now, not all members of this order were large, but many were, especially those that belonged to the suborder Paleodictyoptera, which contained the Mesothyros, a very large insect that literally had a wingspan of 56 centimeters or 1.8 feet. Yeah, imagine that flying into your face. Not great for your heart, that's for sure. And numerous Paleodictyoptera had similar large wingspans. Yet the saving grace in this bunch is that as far as we know, they were herbivores, not predators, possessing unique beak-like mouths that allowed them to pierce plant tissue, from which they could then take in all that ooey gooey goodness, so you could say, having a pump and suck like feeding strategy. So, a bit like a giant mosquito, except instead of animal blood, it's plant juice they're after. And based on the fossil record, it's clear that this tactic worked wonders for this order and superorder, as they're typically found in very high concentrations, especially along what would have been river deltas, in some cases accounting for 50% of the biomass in a total area. So yeah, whole lot of bug. But like I said, thankfully animals dodged a bullet, with plants taking a fall for us instead. But sadly for all my eukaryotes, which includes you by the way, there were other high flyers that were still uncomfortably big, and a bit more feisty at that too. And of all the nightmares the Carboniferous cooked up, no winged insects were as notorious as the Meganosoptera. Like the previous group, these guys were an order of insects, but they showed up a bit later, first having evolved during the late Carboniferous. And while the Paleodictyoptera looked like mayflies, these guys resembled another living group of insects, dragonflies, which has led to them being nicknamed the giant dragonflies. Although, this is incorrect, because despite the similarities, the two are only distantly related, and actually, it's a bit more accurate to refer to this ancient order as giant griffinflies. However, at a distance you probably would confuse them for nothing other than a dragonfly. That is, until one of them landed on you, and then you would suddenly know this is no fly, but rather a dragon. And they were somehow even larger than the Paleodictyoptera, with the largest members, like the Meganeura, achieving wingspans in excess of 2 feet or 0.6 meters. Making them among the largest insects to ever live, let alone fly. And these guys were definitely efficient flyers, utilizing 4 strong semi-transparent wings to blitz through the air and swoop down upon unsuspecting prey, which they would capture with the aid of relatively long, powerful legs that were covered in numerous spines, acting as an inescapable trap, and entombing the captured animals into a fatal embrace. A fatal embrace where they would then proceed to get munched upon, usually alive, might I add, with their giant griffinfly-serrated mandibles. And given just how ridiculously large these insects could get, it wouldn't have just been their fellow bugs that ended up being tormented, with amphibians, small fish, and certain arthropods all being on the menu for these supersized flies. And together, these two orders would dominate the skies for millions of years. However, it does seem like Mother Nature eventually developed her own slight phobia of giant bugs, as the flying insects regime of terror was dealt a devastating blow during the final days of the Carboniferous period, as that is when the Carboniferous rainforest collapse occurred. Now, this is a rather minor extinction as far as extinction events go, but it still had a profound impact on the way Earth functioned and looked. It's thought that during this collapse, the climate of Earth began to shift from wetter and warmer conditions to colder, more arid ones, drying out the expansive swamps, so to speak. While the aridity might have also led to widespread forest fires that burned bright, massive, and long, thanks to the abundance of plant material. And within a rather short amount of time, the coal swamps of Earth were rapidly wiped out, with only small refuges being left standing. And given just how much these insects relied on these sprawling swamps, they were obviously dealt a massive blow, with a notable extinction pulse being seen in the fossil record. And that pulse of course extended to our flying giants, and many species and genera in these orders were wiped out as the world transformed and the Permian began. Yet with that said, here's the interesting thing that most people don't know, which is that while diversity definitely declined after the Carboniferous ended, the age of insects didn't just suddenly stop. Both the Meganosoptera and Paleodictyoptera survived well into the Permian and remained actually largely successful, still representing large portions of the arthropod biomass on land, and even retaining some of that impressive size. And actually, in the case of the Meganosoptera, their possible largest member ever, and potentially the largest insect of all time, might have only showed up during the Permian, this being the Meganeuropsis. This guy was still a dragonfly-like insect in most senses, but leaning much more towards the dragon side, capable of having a wingspan of up to 2.3 feet or 70 centimeters wide, while its body itself could have gotten up to 1.4 feet or 42 centimeters. So basically Mothra. And this giant specifically lived in the North American region of Pangaea, and it and its family would continue to survive all the way up to the late Permian, and this actually included the Paleodictyoptera as well, Meaning, while most think that after the Carboniferous, you wouldn't have to worry about some big bugs landing on you, the truth is, you definitely still would have to be on the lookout, all the while being chased by gorgons and the other unpleasantries of the Permian. However, as you may be aware, something happened in these last days of this period that figuratively marked the final time insects were in charge of the skies for good, as neither order would make it to the Triassic, and flying bugs would never again reach such sizes. Knock on wood, that is. And while we aren't exactly sure what took these guys for good, it is an interesting observation that their demise somewhat coincides with the emergence of gliding reptiles. But that being said, paleontologists do not actually think that had anything to do with the insect's fall off. Instead, it's believed to have been a few factors, likely more having to do with the climate and oxygen levels. But for now, it remains more of a mystery than not. Thanks for watching, and until next time on Extinct Zoo.